Okay, so I think, Julia, we can start.
Thank you, Sophia. Well, first of all, welcome everyone to today's public event. Thank you very much for joining us. And before we begin, I would like to share with you some important information to ensure a smooth communication and a positive event for everyone. First, I would like to remind you that there is interpretation for this event in English, Spanish, and French. You can find the interpretation function at the bottom of the Zoom screen. You can simply click on the interpretation icon and select your preferred language. To facilitate the effective communication, I kindly request everyone to please stay on mute throughout the whole event. And if you wish to speak, please use the raise hand function, which you can find also at the bottom of the screen. I would like to remind everyone as well to speak slowly and clearly so that the interpreters can do their job effectively and everyone can be understood by the whole audience. And then I encourage everyone to use headphones, and if you have also with the incorporated microphone, if possible, because this really improves the audio experience for the interpreters. Then please stay in a quiet location without background noise, because otherwise it will be hard for the interpreters to do their job. And last thing, I would like to remind everyone that this event is recorded. I hope that's fine with everyone. And if you have any concern, please indicate that in the chat to us. Thank you, Sofía.
Bien, muchas gracias y de nuevo, muy buenos
Thank
días.
you. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to one and all. Thank you for joining us today in this conversation. My name is Sofia Monsalve. I am the Secretary General of FIAN International, and I'm here wearing various different hats at this particular event. We're working, in fact, in collaboration with various different organizations. Therefore, welcome to this webinar organized by the International Panel of Experts on Sustainable Food Systems, IPES-Food, the Civil Society and Indigenous Peoples Mechanism, and its liaison group for the autonomous response to the World Summit on Food Systems, and the People's Working Group on Multistakeholderism, which basically focuses on analyzing this and acting on this phenomenon across various sectors of the UN system. So therefore, today we are kicking off a range of activities this week and next week. And our goal is to find a counterpoint to come up with critical perspectives on the World Food Systems event, the stock-taking event 2 years later that will be held on the 24th to 26th of July. Now, we will be beginning today by discussing the idea of global food governance. So, who decides what we eat? How we organize the production, the distribution, and the consumption of food. In general terms, we discuss this topic on a global level in Rome within the framework of the CFS and the 3 United Nations organizations that specialize in food and agriculture. Today, however, we'd like to broaden our thinking by taking into account the broader governance discussions that are currently being held in New York. The UN Secretary General has called for a summit on the future in 2025. By 2025. This September, therefore, there will be a high-level preparatory meeting in New York. Many proposals are being discussed, and these proposals aim to reform the United Nations, to change its functioning and architecture in key areas, such as financial governance. So, therefore, what effect will these changes have on food governance? What experiences have we had, and what lessons have we learned in the field of food that we can bring into the general discussion on how to reform global governance? This, therefore, is the dual objective of our conversation today. Now, in specific terms, we would like to answer a range of different questions. What are the main debates and controversies that are taking place in the run-up to the Summit on the Future? In particular, what is the controversy between multilateralism and multi-stakeholderism about? This is a debate on how to displace states within international governance discussions about the decision-making process. And if we want to privatize the decision-making process, we are going to therefore organize informal events in which we invite many stakeholders to take part. This is the central debate that we must focus on. In fact, this is a debate that is being held across the United Nations system. The next question is, what are the experiences, achievements, and lessons learned in global foods governance? But since the CFS reform 2009, particularly at the level of national experience. In fact, today we will hear from many different countries, and it is therefore very important that we understand what governance systems we need at both national and international levels. Now, the program has changed slightly today. You will have seen in the program that we invited various government representatives, including the Permanent Ambassador for Cuba in New York, who is currently the president of G77 Group. Unfortunately, the representative from Cuba cannot be with us today because she had an urgent commitment. This is a very big shame because Cuba is doing a great deal of interesting work within the framework of the G77 group of countries, within the framework of the Food System Summit. Therefore, we have Harris Gleckman today, who is a senior fellow at the Center on Governance and Sustainability at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. And in fact, he has been discussing these issues with the ambassador from Cuba, and therefore he will be able to take her place today, and he can give us an outline of the main issues at stake in the Food Systems Summit. That's the first change to our program. The second change to our program is to do with the participation of Kelly Mafford, the National Secretary for Social Dialogues, and for the General Secretariat of the President of Brazil. Sadly, she cannot be with us for the entire webinar today, and for this reason, we have to change the list of speakers. We will begin, therefore, with some overall reflections from Harris, and he will be followed by Kelly, who will tell us about the importance of social participation in national governance and in global governance. Therefore, without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to Harris. 7 minutes, Harris. The floor is yours. Microphone.
Thank you very much, Sophia, and thank you to all who are joining the conversation today. What I would like to try to do is to give you a sense of the history of what's occurring, a sense of what's actually occurring today in the process, and a brief, if I could be risky, forecast of what's about to happen. Before I do, I'm going to cheat on my own schedule by saying that the three upcoming events, which are very important, will be a release later this month by the Secretary General of what he is calling a policy brief on the UN 2.0. The other crucial thing is that at the same period of time that the governments are discussing the Summit for the Future, the preparations are ongoing for the SDG Summit in September this year. On the Summit for the Future in September will be a ministerial So having broken my conclusions a bit about what's happening, let me step back and share some of the history and background and what is occurring at the moment. The background for the Summit for the Future starts with the fact that there was a 75th birthday of the UN a few years ago during COVID. And at that outcome, the governments asked the Secretary General to prepare a plan for what should come for the next period of time in global governance. This plan, which he called our common agenda, is the central part of the discussion coming forward and our return to it. The second important part of the background is the current geopolitics. We have to remember that not only are there north-south tensions, there are clearly war and competitive economic issues east-west between Europe, the United States, and Russia. There are similar tensions in the Asian area. There are efforts to multipolarity through the BRICS. The EU is trying to express its role in global governance. And all of these larger macroeconomic realities are affecting a conversation about the Summit for the Future. The SDGs paper, Our Common Agenda, called for a multi-stakeholder Summit for the Future in September 23. This phrase, amongst his 90 recommendations, is the center of the question of global governance. He called for a multi-stakeholder event. He called for a summit. It's not clear if there's multiple actors, including the corporate sector. What does summit even means? He said he wants it about the future. Does that include the present as well as the future? And he wanted it within almost a year of when he announced it. Since that invitation to have a multi-stakeholder summit for the future in 2023, the whole phrase has become, the words in the phrase have become each a debate. Beside the agenda for the common agenda, there are three other important sets of documents that are relevant to the discussion of what's happening now. The Secretary General invited a number of senior advisors, which he called the high-level panel advisory board on effective multilateralism, to prepare some additional ideas for his consideration. The Secretary General has continued in 2023 to issue a series of policy briefs. There will be 8. One of those policy briefs is the one I mentioned earlier, referring to what he envisions the United Nations 2.0 would look like. It is important to realize that while it's called United Nations, it's probably going to be comprehensive and be United Nations System 2.0, and therefore have as much to do with what happens in New York as to what happens in other parts of the major UN cities and the Bretton Woods institutions. And the fourth set of papers is that there are co-facilitators, Germany and Namibia. Co-facilitators are now producing documents which attempt to summarize the status of where discussions are. So again, there are 4 papers, and it's an introduction to the complexity of what is occurring in New York. There's the original Our Common Agenda, the report of the High-Level Advisory Board, the multiple series of policy briefs, and the co-facilitators' texts. What I want to share with you is some of the tensions around this discussion at the moment, 5 of them, and look at more carefully at one particular piece of the co-facilitators' current summary. First, as Sophia was saying, is a major tension between multilateralism and multistakeholderism in future issues. Secretary General proposed not only a multi-stakeholder summit for the future, but 9 new different multi-stakeholder groups. And significantly, he proposed no new intergovernmental negotiations going forward. The group of 77, in reacting to this, went to the Secretary General and said, a multi-stakeholder group should not be the deciding group for the future. And the Secretary General conceded, and now that it is a multilaterally led by the President of the General Assembly and the members of states, the UN Summit for the Future. But this tension between multi-stakeholderism and multilateralism remains live and is an important question as to whether who governs is going to be governments or multi-stakeholder groups, which are led and dominated by transnational corporations, bringing in some academics and some civil society groups, and they're taking on and claiming a legitimacy in global governance. So this tension will remain through September of next year, at least. The second is a tension between the Office of the Secretary General and the governments in New York. And that is reflected in part in the split between whether it's going to be a multi-stakeholder world in the future, but also by what are the important issues that the Summit for the Future should address, and which ones from peace and security, which ones relating to other issues should be central into the outcome. I'll return to that in a moment when we look at the co-facilitators' text.
Sorry, Harris, last minute to wrap up.
Okay.
Very short, I know.
The cutting edge point that in the summary is what is the vision that is coming out of this? There are those looking at the future and saying 75 years has had one governance structure at the UN, desire a completely new arrangement for global governance for leadership in the future. There are others who are going to say that they know that the current system is not delivering in peace, in food, in areas, but they just will make incremental minor changes and call them major changes. And so what one is seeing in the co-facilitators papers, what is seeing in the civil society groups which are organizing around this, called C4UN, Citizens for the United Nations, is there a separate effort to define what's the content of a pact for the future, which will be the document that's involved. And I think that's been put in the chat, the draft from the current co-facilitators. And I think that you will hear later and in many ways that each of the phrases about the summit, the future, what's to be accomplished in September of 24 remain contentious issues. Thank you, Sophia.
Muchísimas gracias, Harry. Disculpas por tener que interrumpirte cuando se estaba.
Thank you so much, Harris, and apologies for interrupting when it all became more interesting, but certainly we will have time in Q&A afterwards to approach these issues more. Now, I would like to invite Kelly Manfort to join us and to give us her presentation. Kelly, you have 7 minutes. Thank you, Sophia, for organizing the event. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you to Martin. Thank you to Elisabetta as well. Thank you also to Harris and the other panelists. I do apologize. I will have to leave this webinar as soon as I finish with my presentation because we have to attend to some urgent matters within our ministry. So I'm going to talk about Brazil. From the Palace of the Presidency of the Republic, I am joined by members of my team today. And we are going to talk about social participation in Brazil, and also as a way of reflecting on the major challenges of a global governance, particularly global food governance. And particularly, we must focus on the issues related to multi-stakeholderism. Now, social participation is enshrined within the Constitution of Brazil. I'd ask for you to move on to the next slide. Thank you. Thank you. So the foundations for social participation, as I say, are enshrined within our Constitution. And we have the 1988 Citizen Constitution of Brazil. And this is quite clear on the fact that there should be decision-making with an emphasis on referenda, plebiscites, and popular initiatives for participatory democracy. This is enshrined within our Constitution. Next slide, please. Now, we, as with many other countries from Latin America, from Africa, and other parts of the world, we have certainly suffered from many problems. For example, we've seen a coup d'etat. We had an institutional coup in 2016 with the impeachment of President Dilma Rousseff. This was followed by the governments of Temer and Bolsonaro that destroyed social policy, human rights, and any kind of popular participation. Certainly. The Bolsonaro government was a far-right administration, and it destroyed all the social underpinnings of our society. And in fact, these are elements that were enshrined in the Constitution of Brazil. Naturally, there was a lot of resistance from Brazilian society, particularly during the particularly tough years of the pandemic. In fact, more than 700,000 Brazilians died during COVID, and it also brought back the return of hunger and worsening living conditions for the poorest elements of our society. So there was a lot of resistance in society. And then Lula came back to power on the 30th of October last year. This was a historic moment. And this also meant that popular participation became a key part of the government's response to help us through the process of what is currently happening to us in our country, in Brazil. Next slide, please. And now our government has created a presidential secretariat, which is why I work. In fact, I am the national secretary working at the National Secretariat for the Presidency of Brazil, and we're working on many different areas. Next slide, please. So the new government has created the General Secretariat of the Presidency, which is responsible for coordinating the policies and the systems of social participation under the current government. This is extremely important because we have seen a reform of our system. We have the General Secretariat that works alongside the different ministerial departments. So we work therefore on social participation, social dialogue, public policy, social and political relations, and youth. Next slide, please. So therefore, we can see a greater presence of social participation in the Lula government. It is based on 4 pillars. First of all, an interministerial system of social participation and diversity was created under a national decree. So this meant that there is now an advisory system of social participation and diversity across all the ministries of the government. And then the second step was the creation of a National Council of Social Participation. This provides advisory services to the presidency, and it is, in fact, fully represented, 100% representation of civil society. Therefore, President Lula has a much greater civil society participation in his current government. Next slide, please. And the next step for social participation in the Lula government was the resumption of councils and conferences. This is very important for us because we have what we call councils for rights, which is also set out in our citizens' constitution. And then finally, the fourth step in bringing about greater social participation was the establishment of the Inter-Council Forum. This means that we have an organization that brings together a huge number of people representing all of the rights of our citizens and working alongside the Committee on Food Security. Therefore, you can see, therefore, that is a great more room for social participation in our country. And Sophia, if you wish to share this presentation with the other participants, then please, and you can also ask me any questions if you desire. Thank you so much, Kelly, and thank you for keeping to our strict timing. And thank you also for sharing the institutional reform for greater public participation under the government of Brazil. Let's now hear from our next panelist today, Britt Brennan. She works for the Transnational Institute, and she is also a member of the People's Working Group on Multistakeholderism, which is one of the groups that have organized today's webinar. Britt, you have the floor, 7 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sophia, and good afternoon, morning, whatever time of day with co-panelists and with all the participants. I'm really pleased to be able to participate in this, I guess, exchange at this point, and in sharing our concerns but also our responses to the, well, I think the tensions and challenges laid out by Harris in his introduction in terms of multilateralism and multistakeholderism, and in a way in the encouraging presentation given by our colleague from Brazil and from the Lula government. In a sense, I guess, we stand as civil society and social movements, and certainly it's our concern in the People's Working Group in Multistakeholderism, between, in a way, very strong, by now, in a way, more highly projected sense of threat from the corporate reach of transnational corporations into the system of governance, especially highlighted in sectoral areas of the UN, but actually with a very much more ambitious reach that has been indicated by the proposal from the UN Secretary General for a Summit of the Future, and coming also particularly from the recent publication of the high-level lab, the report from the, in a way, a key advisory body to the UN Secretary General on the course and trajectory for the UN Summit of the Future. Actually, this in a sense underlines key concerns that have begun to be raised and pretty consistently, I think, in the last year or two, in relation to the corporate capture of UN, not only just UN agencies and areas of governance, areas of global governance, but actually of the UN itself. I think this is, it's been touched on, for example, in the Brazilian colleagues' input that so many lives were lost in the COVID. This is a very strong indication of how corporations have functioned in relation to, for example, the WHO, and in relation to the absolute obstinate resistance to moving on the intellectual property rights in relation to how the pharma companies and conglomerations operated and substituted COVAX in a way for the guiding policy on the reach of the vaccines, especially in relation to the global south. I think we also see this in COP. It is the financial sector which organized itself very strongly in a new coalition, the GFANZ, the Global Alliance on Finance for Net Zero, and in a way took the chair, certainly took the future of the COP in its hands at Glasgow. So we have these indications on the sectoral level, but in relation to the corporate level, in relation to the UN as a whole, and I think this is the ambition that we are particularly concerned with today, even though the second part of our webinar will deal mainly with how this is playing out in the food sector. So in relation to that area of the corporate capture of the UN itself, yeah, I would just like to maybe share with you some approaches and strategies that we have been developing and intend to continue developing in the People's Global Working Group on multi-stakeholderism. And these are a combination of two strategies. We think it has been very, very important that the sectoral areas of food, health, education, internet, energy, I mean, we could elaborate on this. How the pushback has been developing there. It's developed not simply in dialogues within the sectors, but it's also developed based on a pushback and resistance on the ground for how corporations are dictating policy that affects daily lives. So this is a very important route of one angle of the strategies that we follow, and in a way form the basis of what we might call a we the people's strategy and approach to the future, the summit of the future. The second element of the strategy is certainly, and is to be welcomed actually, is the intervention of the G77 in the debate. Also very recently with an important statement that was quite explicitly critical both of the direction of the indicated trajectory in the HLAB, but also very much calling for a reset of the time frame. Actually, the Summit of the Future was supposed to take place in 23. It is now reset to 2024. And I guess as we see it, this is really an important and historical opportunity for social movements and civil society to in a way assess this situation and develop a more integrated strategy in our resistance and in the development of our proposals in the coming year. We also see it as very important to develop and work out an intervention with the G77 as we see the possibility of a very important, maybe an even key element in terms of the multilateral character of the UN. Unfortunately, actually, in the last 30 years, we have seen several states, particularly of the global north, being extremely cooperative and complicit in a way with building an architecture around the role of corporations that has kind of immunized it from accountability to citizens, but also accountability to the planet. And I think this is a very important part of the tension that we face, that much work has to be done to move governments and certainly to strengthen the hand of global South governments in this particular confrontation between multi-stakeholderism and multilateralism. So I think it would be quite important for us to, in a way, open our dialogue. And I see today's webinar as part of that. This is not at all an issue for specialists and experts. This is really 75 years after the UN and the putting in place of a multilateral system with all its major flaws. I think we are not naive in that regard. We realize and see the failure, in a sense, of UN governance system in the multiple crises we are currently facing. However, we feel that it is also a new opportunity to address, we'll say, what Allende brought to the UN 50 years ago, very soon, 50 years ago. And we think that this is really the opening that, well, in a way, we have been waiting for. Maybe it has come as a wake-up call, but I think it's also a very historic opportunity. Despite the crisis and the pressing challenges, I think we are on the road to an important we the people's elaboration of strategy. This will need to be an integrated and more comprehensive framework, an opportunity completely lost by the HLAB, you know, who failed actually to address that question of a comprehensive framework or indications of that. We would see it as very important that we will work together with governments to elaborate an integrated framework, which will include a new role in a way, and in a sense, a renewal of a state-centered system that has the capacity of enforcement of policy in relation to corporations. And we can look at the process that's going on in the UN in relation to the binding treaty and corporations and human rights as an indication of ways forward. So I think I can leave it at that. We invite all our participants also to keep in touch on this, and I look forward to hearing your views, and let's make 2023 and the work going to 2024 a new breakthrough indeed for civil society and the UN system. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias, Brit.
Thank you very much, Brit. Thank you for all those ideas and for your call to action. Now let's go on to the last panelist of this section, Michael Fakhri. He is the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food, and he is going to share his thoughts on the Summit on the Future and possible impacts on governance and the right to food. Michael, you have 7 minutes as well.
Thank you, Sophia, and thank you, everyone. So first, I just want to greet everyone. This is a rare privilege for me to greet you from my village, Shadri, in northern Lebanon. So that really, I feel truly empowered to be speaking to you from my village today. And what I'll be talking about will be complementing a lot of the speakers today, adding, but then transitioning to a bit of a focus on food, as Sophia pointed out. And I'm seeing many familiar names and faces here today, and many of us had fought hard either within the Food System Summit structure itself or against it. And many of us that were involved in the Food System Summit in different ways saw firsthand how multi-stakeholderism grants corporations and corporate-friendly interests and groups, it grants them direct access to the United Nations. And what we heard is what this does is it gives not only, so we heard it gives corporations access to the UN, and this increases their governance power. It increases corporations' legitimacy, and brings corporations even closer to international organizations and national governments. What I'll add is, and what we're going to see at the stock taking event in Rome, is that all these corporate-friendly organizations, and what it also gives them is access to the United Nations. And then this leads to consultation contracts, project contracts, and access to financing. So with corporations comes their own body of experts, and they get the legitimacy of the United Nations, and this leads to financing and projects. So we experienced this in the Food Systems Summit. We're going to see this at the stock-taking events in Rome. This also happened at the UN Water Conference that happened in 2023. So what we're seeing then is we had the Food Summit, we had the Water Conference. These were sort of the beginnings, and what we're hearing is we might see something similar, but at a profoundly larger scale at the summit for the future. What I can share with everyone is I happened to be at the first organizing meeting for the Summit for the Future that was held in New York. I believe it was last year. And it just so happened I was at the right place at the right time. Human rights was not on that first organizing agenda. The only reason I was able to attend, amongst some other colleagues, other special rapporteurs, is by chance, another special rapporteur had dinner with an ambassador the night before and said, by the way, human rights is not on the agenda. They stuck us in at the end, and we were supposed to speak for 5 minutes. We ended up speaking for 2 minutes. That tells you a lot, that from the beginning, human rights is not on the agenda. And even when we manage to get onto the agenda, it's in the margins at the very end. This is the same thing that's going to happen at the stock-taking event. At the stock-taking event, the right to food and human rights is not on the agenda. It is in a side event that we had to apply for. So we had to apply through an NGO to get human rights on the agenda, as if human rights is not an obligation, as if it's something we sort of tick a box on. What's interesting to me, and I'm still thinking through this, and maybe this is something we can discuss in the Q&A, is what we're confronting, and what I've been confronting, is it's not that corporations are trying to capture human rights. In other forums they do, and in their annual briefs and through corporate social responsibility language they try to. But in this space of global governance, they're not trying to capture human rights. What they're doing is they're excluding it. And when forced, they allow it in and they keep it in and on the margins. My best guess is that tells me is that people's movements, social organizations, social movements, trade unions, indigenous peoples, they have managed to keep, in the space I'm in, the right to food, but one could argue human rights as a powerful tool that can be deployed as a tool of resistance, right? It's hard for them to capture human rights because it remains in the hands of the people. So the challenge, and we heard this from Brid, is that everyone knows that multilateralism doesn't work. So when I use the term multilateralism against multi-stakeholderism, I have to admit, I use it almost as a placeholder. Because what I'm not fighting for is multilateralism as we understand it today. And so I've been trying to think about what kind of multilateralism should we be fighting for. The General Assembly has called for a reinvigorated multilateralism. And historically, when multilateralism did work, I think it had sort of the golden age was after the Bandung Conference of 1955 till maybe around the early 1970s. It's when what were called newly independent countries of Asia and Africa worked in solidarity and connected to Latin America on an explicitly anti-imperial agenda. And the third world countries, as they were called, had a very particular ideology and framework. So it wasn't just political interests. And that's when multilateralism worked, and they used the UN to express this power. However, since the 1980s, the world has not seen that degree of anti-imperial solidarity amongst countries. Moreover, Western countries do not always respect the sovereignty of other states, and often fall back on racist notions of sovereignty. But I should add, it is often common for developing countries, the so-called global south, to use their sovereignty to not only protect themselves against foreign interference, but they often use claims of sovereignty to avoid their human rights obligations. This is the new landscape we face today, unlike in the 1950s and 60s. What gives me hope is when I talk to governments like Brazil, South Africa, Germany, Mexico, Cuba, Honduras, Colombia, Switzerland, around the right to food, I see a lot of similarities. I see potential for a right to food alliance that can really drive things forward. In my remaining 30 seconds, Sophia, if I may take just a little bit to conclude very quickly, I wonder then how to, thank you, if multilateralism can be reinvigorated if we build it on the notion of food sovereignty, to really explicitly and consciously talk together about what does that mean to connect the two. What this means is this. It means acknowledging that peasants, workers, fishers, pastoralists, and consumers, they possess the true power in food systems. So it would be a multilateralism that identifies food providers as autonomous, self-organized constituents linked to consumers who have control over how we eat, and they guide our relationship to the land and to the water. So this means its constituents are included in discussions and negotiations, like we heard the example in Brazil, but there are examples internationally. Many of us might know the example of the CSIPM at the Committee on World Food Security, but I'll add the International Labor Organization. Unions have a vote, admittedly alongside with management, but also the Arctic Council gives indigenous peoples a permanent position. So there are examples of we can build upon this. In sum, a multilateralism anchored in food sovereignty recognizes that a state's territorial power derives from a government's good relations with people and people's ability to organize themselves within food systems. So this could be the way forward, where we're talking about strong land and territorial rights, genuine agrarian reform, labor laws that create dignified work. That would be the basis of a reinvigorated multilateralism. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias, Michael.
Thank you very much, Michael, for those very interesting thoughts about how to infuse our achievements into the discussion. Now, after those presentations, I'm going to open a first round of questions or comments from the floor before we get into the second round of presentations. So would anybody like to take the floor? If I could ask you to make your comments short, just 1 minute, so that we can let as many people as possible speak. Perhaps Martin and Julia can help me to see who's requesting the floor. Ah, yes, Judith, you're asking for the floor, and then Antonio. Judith.
Un minuto, por favor.
1 minute, please.
Thank you very much, everybody. I totally agree with everything that has been said. I think that there is still one element missing, which is the underlying neoliberal capitalist system, which is really behind all of this stranglehold of the United Nations system. On the 18th of April, the UN voted a resolution in support of social and solidarity economy. And I believe it's very important that we include in our discussion and in our arguments, not only food sovereignty, not only the multilateralism that we wish to see, but also the basis of a different economic path forward based on social and solidarity economy. Thank you.
Gracias, Judith. Antonio, por
Thank you,
favor.
Judith. Antonio, please.
Yeah, sure. My name is Antonio Tovar from the Farmwork Association of Florida. I just want to say that it is not, it doesn't surprise me that human rights is not included for corporations, because corporations, they abuse workers right and left. They take advantage of farmers. So for corporations to think about human rights is actually in their disadvantage. Because they need to exploit people. to make their profits. So thank you, and great presentations. Thank you.
Gracias, Antonio.
Thank you, Antonio. Can we take maybe one or two more speakers? But I don't see anybody asking for the floor. Well, there's lots of comments in the chat. That's very interesting. Right. In that case, let's start the second segment of presentations. So we've just had an overview on the current global discourse and debates on multilateralism. Now, we would like to take a more territorial view and find out what experience and learnings there have been when it comes to designing food governance, the kind of food governance that we would like, both at national and international level, since the creation of the CSM. We'd also like to hear about our response to the Summit on Food Sovereignty in 2021. As you remember, we participated autonomously in that summit because we saw that our concerns and our ideas were not being represented when it came to our ideals on democracy. So that's a reminder of the context, and these are the subjects that the following speakers are going to address. Unfortunately, there's been another change to the program, and unfortunately, Victor Suarez, the Deputy Minister for Agriculture from Mexico, is not going to be able to attend. He sends his apologies, but something urgent came up in his diary, so he won't be with us today, but he sends his wishes, his good wishes, and we hope to see him in another event this week. Right, so let's begin this round with Ambassador Nosifo Nauska Jangezil from the Republic of South Africa. She is the permanent representative of her country to Rome. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Good afternoon. Am I audible?
Yes, perfectly well.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I would like to. Okay, thank you very much for this opportunity. I'll start just by a short context and outline that, again, in terms of Article 11 is already articulated by Michael and the others, that food is a fundamental human right, and we need to take steps to realize and to hunger. Thus, in essence, it's instructive to implement the 2030 agenda, which is being pursued under the auspices of the UN systems. This then recognizes that there should be adequate availability of nutritious foods. And also, I would like you to run the slide. Sorry, I'm not. Okay, thank you, Secretariat. So in essence, to make sure that we realize a life with dignity based on the provision of adequate foods and nutritious foods. We already also aware that to achieve food sovereignty and the adequate food, we require sustainable food systems, which therefore become a prerequisite and a breakthrough for people and planet. The global food security, if we are to reflect on the challenges that we face today, related to whether it's environmental degradation in terms of soils and soil health, ecosystem degradation, biodiversity loss, climate change, pollution of water resources, use of chemicals, pesticides, water availability and efficient use of water resources, wars and conflicts. These are all the challenges that we face today as the globe. And in order to tackle the Sustainable Development Goals in relation to delivery of food, we do then require or underscore the importance of sustainable food systems, which are resilient and just for the current and future generations. Coming to multilateralism, again, South Africa, because that's my country that I represent in the UN system. It is a country that is committed to make its contribution to strengthen multilateralism, especially in the context of transforming agri-food systems that are to become more efficient, inclusive, resilient, and sustainable in support of advancing the 2030 agenda, as well as the 2063 agenda for the Africa we want. And South Africa is a constitutional democracy which recognizes the right to food. We are a country that's a signatory to a number of multilateral agreements and a member of the Committee on Food Security, which is my subject of the intervention this afternoon. The Committee on Food Security, or World Food Security, was established in 1974 as an intergovernmental body and to serve as a forum of the UN system that would review and follow up on policies concerning world food security, including but not limited to production, physical and economic access to food. And therefore CFS, it is my argument and my understanding that it can serve as an effective and inclusive global governance for food today and into the future. The Committee on Food Security is an important institution to pursue the progressive realization of the right to food, and it being an intergovernmental platform with at least at the time of checking the numbers, we have 137 member countries, and it has a convening power that would utilize its partnership with the Rome-based agencies and other UN agencies, including scientific bodies, with the added value of civil society, indigenous peoples' rights, as well as the private sector, in order to coordinate a global approach to the topic of food security. And I'm not going to go into the longer details, however, it's just to highlight that it's an institution that's established in terms of the founding documentation, and it has recently also established collaboration mechanisms with other agencies like the FAO, IFAD, UNICEF, and World Health Organization, even as we had a preparation and the report on the state of food security and nutrition in the world, which is referred to as SOFI report. So this is a platform that coordinates a global approach to food security, promoting convergence where it's possible, and it provides policy support and advice to countries and regions, including to other stakeholders, and promotes accountability and transparency, especially in respect of best practices. And this is then the institution that has the ability to catalyze a scale in terms of change in advancing food security into the future. Under the CFS, there are a number of voluntary guidelines, one of which is the voluntary guidelines on the right to adequate food, which would be guidelines that would realize 20 years next year. And we again purport to use the CFS 51, which takes place this year, to actually begin to think about an agenda that puts fully into a transparent platform how human rights approach could be realized in securing sustainable food systems. And a multi-stakeholder inclusive monitoring system is already outlined in the CFS guidelines, and therefore that could also serve as an evidence-based policy implementation framework for all parties that are interested in the topic of food. The Committee on Food Security, again, is composed of a number of stakeholders, as I indicated. It has got member states and other participants and observers, and the members of the committee. It is already enabling participation of other institutions, including the UN bodies like the FAO, IPES-Food, and World Food Programme. It is also open to non-member states of the FAO that are member states of the United Nations, again, which is a unique feature in terms of the CFS. And the other member states are also encouraged to participate in CFS sessions at the highest level possible. Again, coming to the next slide, I just outline again here the opportunity for CFS to be inclusive and therefore to provide a platform for transparency, both in terms of the science world, indigenous knowledge systems, the private sector associations and private philanthropic foundations are also represented, and CFS may invite other interested organizations that are relevant to its work to observe the entire sessions on specific agenda items. And this is just a unique proposition in the context of the existing UN agencies and UN bodies. In final regards, I would rush through without outlining this plenary, this secretariat, which is also outlined how it operates. There is a bureau, and the bureau also includes the high-level panel, which is an independent panel, and its work does get reflected upon through that independence of the bureau. It provides support, the bureau provides support to plenary, and also there is an advisory group, and the HLPE has that ability to revise or at least present its findings and have an interaction early on, even before going to advise the plenary.
Excuse me, Ambassador. The last minute to wrap up, please.
Okay. So the high-level panel of experts on food security and nutrition is one mechanism that was created post the review of the CFS, and since 2009, there was that creation of that essential part, which provides an independent and a scientific knowledge-based analysis and advice to CFS. And lastly, next slide on the UN food systems. It is my thought that the UNF Food Systems Summit in 2021 was a platform for a dialogue of multiple stakeholders, again, with a limited practice of continuous governance and ongoing participation, and therefore it does not quite offer a solution to revival of our global governance, especially under the thoughts that are outlined on the future of multilateralism. And therefore, I would be one of the people that propose that CFS does provide a global platform with its established governance as a prerequisite for a credible review and evidence-based stock-taking system, which currently is not existing. Hence, I would say that in the context of the intergovernmental UN institutions, CFS would be able to provide such a platform. And lastly, my recommendation, therefore, is that we consider that the CFS is maybe taking even from some of the outlines from the high-level advisory board that was appointed by the UN Secretary General, which underscores the advancement of the 2030 agenda for sustainable development, in essence requiring effective and inclusive global governance for today and future, and such that one would still say the CFS structures and governance offer such an innovative platform to enable the advancement of an inclusive global multilateralism. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I'm sorry for running over.
Muchísimas gracias, embajadora, por sus recomendaciones.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, for your very clear recommendations. We take note. Now, I would like to ask the Saima Zia to talk to us, representing La Vieja Campesina from Pakistan, and will be talking on behalf of the autonomous response of civil society to the UN Food System Summit. Saima, you have the floor. 7 minutes, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophia. I hope I will conclude in 7 minutes. Thank you so much. Yeah, it's been a debate about the food summit and what is happening around that. It is actually a very much concern for the smallholders and indigenous peoples, because what we are thinking about that it is we are going to lose control on our own food and on our resources. This is the major concern. What is the whatever is happening in the UN spaces and what is happening around there, because the UN is continuously pushing the multinational and corporations to in this food system, and this is actually a very much large struggle between those people who benefit from the status quo or those who are calling for a more just and sustainable food system. And this is also is like a test for the UN, that is the UN is willing to stand up to the corporate interests or put up the people and planet first. And this summit will have a major impact on food and for our food systems, on our environment and our democracy and everything which have been there. But we need to build a platform. We need to be at the platform for which can bring us to the real food system change. And we should not be on the vehicle which is driving corporate interests. The thing is these multi-corporations, they are coming to our places and telling to the indigenous peoples that you are harming the environment. You are the way you are cultivating the land, the way you are using the resources. So for the centuries, these indigenous people, they are keeping safe their environment. They are keeping safe their forest, their resources, their water, their food. But now these corporations are coming and they're ruining and destroying all the resources and the environment and climate. It is affecting the climate. And then these so-called experts, they are coming to our land and to telling us that this thing is not beneficial for you, and this thing is beneficial for you. You should grow this and you should grow this. This should not be happening. So you are the one who are destroying our forests, who are destroying our water. This water was very much free for everyone. Like for centuries, people were drinking water. So it was for free. Then the corporations came and they started to sell this water. They put it in the plastic bottles and then they started to say, oh, this plastic is harming the environment. So this is the thing, like these corporations should not be the one who are telling us what to do, who are telling to the indigenous people. So we need to create a food system that is based on principle of justice, sustainability, and equity. Social movements and indigenous people and other civil society organizations from around the world, we should raise our voices once again against the corporate capture of the United States. And we are demanding the food system change that put people and the planet first, not like the corporate agenda. And whatever it's the corporate capture is happening in the UN or in the other systems in the world, that is a very much threat to our food system, to our environment. And we need to demand our rights for the future generations, because the major concerns for the smallholders and for the indigenous people, like they will have been deprived from their own food and their own resources. What will happen if the corporates are there? And so many it is happening not in my country, in Pakistan, but also in other countries too. The government is selling the land to the corporate sector for the corporate farming, and the smallholders have been deprived from their land. And also in this system, like these are obviously major factors around that, especially in case of Pakistan. There is China, which is very much involved in the corporate farming. So we must not allow the UN to be captured by the corporate interests. This is the, we need the food system which is work for everyone, work for where the smallholders, the indigenous people, they also have their share. This is not like should be only the thing is multilateralism and multi-stakeholderism is like a debate, but the common people, the common smallholders, indigenous people, they don't know these terms. They just want to be in the system where they have been doing all the efforts. And whatever is the corporate sector will be going to do. Again, like what are they doing in the corporate sector? The violation, the extreme violation of the workers' right, extreme violation of the human rights, which is happening. This is like a multiple, so many stories which can be like described maybe in our need not only hours but minutes or days, but it can be described in years what is happening there. Because I was working in the informal sector, when I started to work in this sector. So the extreme violations of the workers' rights have been happening. And the same thing is like at this time now, the smallholders and indigenous peoples, they are very much worried about that. If the corporate sector, they will capture our land, they will capture our resources. So we need to be very focused, and we need to be very clear that what alternate approaches and for the transformation of the food system we want. We want to focus on the first thing, like we want to be focused on the food sovereignty. This is like means like that the communities should control their own production, their own distribution, consumption of their food. This should not be the rich people or corporations should telling them this, do this or do this. And also we need to more focused on the agroecology or natural sustainable food systems, which can be benefit to our environment too. And also this is to improve the soil health and all these, because these corporations, they are only focusing to sell their pesticides and their seed and all this. And smallholders, also need to control their own seeds, because seed is the basic thing which can be, if the corporations, they already taken control of this, but they in future they are taking more control. So it will be like very difficult for the smallholders, like how they will be surviving in this system if they lose control on their own seed, how they can grow their own food. So also we should have been able to recognize the rights of the smallholders and indigenous peoples. And this is because these people and these smallholders, they are the backbone of this food system. If they have been eliminated or if they have been deprived during this whole process, so this whole, this can be affected for our next generation. What will happen to this this planet? What will happen to all these people who have been already at the stake of these rich people, and these rich people are very much exploiting them? And the next thing will be happening, like they will be all on the mercy of these corporates. We need to be like very much clear, and we need to be very much focused on that, on our position and or our points and whatever we need to be focused on. And the most important thing, the special, we need to strengthen the more farmer organizations, smallholder organization, indigenous peoples organization, so they can be there whenever this is happening. They can be there to raise their voices, and they can reclaim and claim their own resources. Thank you, Sofia.
Muchísimas gracias, Saima, por la perspectiva.
Thank you so much, Saima, for bringing us news on the struggle for food producers across the world. We are now going to be hearing from our last panelist, Molly Anderson. She is president of she's a food studies chair at Middlebury College in the United States, and IPES-Food member. So Molly, therefore you have the floor. 7 minutes, thank you.
And thank you to the organizers for this invitation to talk with you. It's wonderful to see so many friends in the audience, so many people who have come together to discuss these issues. I want to address both of the questions that Sophia put before us, our experiences of the recent history of global food governance since the reform of the Committee on World Food Security, but also how the controversy between multilateralism and multistakeholderism played out in the context of the UN Food System Summit, and what that has to say about this summit stock-taking moment, what we can foresee. So the reform of the CFS in 2009 gave civil society an important platform to speak directly to government delegates and others attending the CFS meetings, but civil society still encounters challenges. For example, some chairs of the CFS feel that it's necessary to allow the private sector to speak every time the CSIPM speaks, which gives the illusion that the two are equivalent. But civil society consists of a far larger number of constituents than the private sector and represents rights holders and those whose rights are being violated, unlike members of the private sector who are sometimes the violators of those rights. In my view, the CFS should center its sessions around the needs of the CSIPM to fulfill its mandate to be based in the right to food. Another challenge that we're seeing is that major exporting countries have become more vehement, more obstinate over the last few years in obstructing recommendations from the CSIPM. And weaker countries are reluctant to openly oppose these more powerful countries. A third challenge that's been referred to previously has been the growing power of concentrated corporations vis-a-vis FAO. For example, through the memoranda of understanding between FAO, CropLife, and the International Fertilizer Association. These MOUs signal that FAO and the UN more broadly are increasingly interested in partnerships with industry rather than in making decisions that benefit the public good. Contrast FAO's stance toward the private sector with UNICEF's policy on engagement with food and beverage industries that's been stimulated by growing scientific evidence of the health impacts of ultra-processed food. Their policy is to continue to advocate for the food and beverage industry not to be included in public policy making and to avoid all partnerships with ultra-processed food and beverage industries. FAO should follow suit by avoiding all partnerships with companies that produce and profit from synthetic pesticides and fertilizers, which are largely responsible for the insect apocalypse and the destruction of soil microbiodiversity. These companies should not be part of public policymaking forums such as the CFS, yet, as we've heard, FAO and the UN more generally are moving in the opposite direction by creating more partnerships with the private sector. So moving to the Food Systems Summit, this was a major shift in how questions of global food governance would be resolved, from multilateral discussion and negotiation among states which are accountable to their citizens to multi-stakeholderism. The summit, and to all indications, Summit +2 that's coming up didn't and won't address the real causes of problems in the food system. First, the power asymmetries between corporations that are rolling over human rights with little regulation, and people, especially small-scale farmers who comprise the majority of food insecure people in the world, and marginalized populations. Second, the tremendous inequality of wealth, resources, and political power within and between countries. Third, the exacerbating influences of COVID, climate change, and conflict that we're seeing all around the world. And fourth, the lack of democratic, inclusive governance by the people who are most affected by food system decisions, including these smallholders. Human rights, as Michael Fakhri told us, did not figure prominently in the summit, and existing human rights-based UN institutions such as the CFS were sidelined. Despite promises not to create new institutions, we now have a coordination hub much better funded than the CFS. Civil society was quite divided on the UNFSS. It inspired greater coherence and opposition. 9,000 people participated in the counter-mobilization, but it was also divisive because some members of civil society decided to participate and others abstained. The summit organizers created a civil society space, but it wasn't autonomously organized by civil society, and civil society participants to panels were cherry-picked. They avoided people who would be critical of the summit. The summit was dominated by corporate interests, from the selection of Agnes Kalibata, the president of AGRA, to be UN special envoy for the summit, to heavy involvement of coalitions and agencies that have strong corporate representation or partnerships in each of the action tracks, and they are still dominant in the coordination hub. The summit advanced a very narrow concept of science and knowledge, thus ignoring other sources of knowledge, such as indigenous, feminist, traditional, that have tremendous potential for contributing to real solutions to food system problems. The summit did not result in outcomes that significantly decreased global malnutrition, hunger, greenhouse gas emissions, or offered clarity on solutions. It collected a chaotic jumble of solutions, but since there was no effort to identify the core problems, there was no coherence to the solutions that were proffered. 37 coalitions have been created, 122 countries have submitted national pathways to dealing with food systems, but there aren't any guidelines on how power differentials and conflicts of interest will be managed in these coalitions or in the buildup to these national food system plans. Pathways discussions in my country were by invitation only, and they did not include members of the North American Civil Society and Indigenous Peoples Group that engages with the CFS. So in sum, the 2021 summit did not advance a coherent pathway to a structural transformation of food systems that would further food sovereignty, planetary health, biodiversity, gender justice, climate justice, economic and social justice, and peace. I am not expecting anything different from the Summit +2, yet tremendous amounts of money are going into organizing these summits, these cumbres. Thank you very much for listening.
Muchísimas gracias, querida Molly, por ese.
Thank you so much, dear Molly, for this recap on our backgrounds and where we're coming from. This brings us to a close. We have heard from all of the panelists. I can see that there has been a very active exchange of views in the chat. We can see, therefore, that there are pressing concerns being addressed throughout the chat. Examples of how corporations want to have greater control over seeds. In the case of Africa, how free trade agreements continue to impose rules on people. The new green revolution of Pakistan and other commenters that we've seen in the chat. Therefore, as an autonomous response to the Food System Summit, we have worked together to be able to combat these problems so that we can therefore link up regionally so that we can be more international, more global. And how, therefore, can we do this? It's a challenge that we must overcome. And it is moments such as today that we need so that we can combine our thinking and join forces to be able to plot a path together. So if you want to talk more about the regional and territorial struggles against corporations, then please feel free to comment. And we could also talk further about UN-related issues, the United Nations that we desire for the future. What future do we see for it, particularly from the perspective of our struggles? I can see that there are many comments, and I can see that certain men have made comments and have raised their hands, but I would also encourage women and people from other groups to also speak up. So let's hear from Ruth, then Miliancy, and then Claudio. Please introduce yourselves before you speak. 1 minute. Ruth, please.
Oh, you're talking to me here.
Yes, I'm talking to you, Ruth. Please introduce yourself.
Sorry. Okay, I call myself a peasant from Canada. I'm a small-scale farmer, organic, regenerative farmer. And I mean, this is such a complex problem. And people in my country are contributing to food insecurity, not only in our own country, but in across the world. We're taught that we're here to feed the world. And my position has always been that people can feed themselves. And so I agree with the speakers who are talking about how corporations, it's basically corporations and government policy that's influenced by corporations that is creating food insecurity. In terms of moving forward in this sort of context, I think we need to stop worrying about including the stakeholders, the corporations, because they hijack this kind of process. If we really want to be moving forward and looking at real reform across the world, we have to recognize that they are not our friends. And their policies and their desire to create profit is creating the food insecurity. Most of my neighbors have already bought into the corporate kind of agribusiness model, and that's destroying it's destroying Canada. It's contributing to the destruction of the environment. It's contributing to food insecurity all across the world because we're an exporting country and we need to stop thinking that way. And I don't know what role the UN can play in creating and bringing together people and facilitating and being a catalyst for civil society groups, for peasants and indigenous people across the world. I'm just not sure what role that can be, but I do think that there needs to be a definitive effort and an understanding that we don't need the stakeholders, the corporate people involved in the process, because they undermine it all.
Muy bien.
Because I have a hard time contributing to food security, and because I'm overwhelmed by the corporate system here. Right? It's hard to have a place to do what I'm doing here. You know, I just sell my bees and pollinators because my neighbor is an agribusiness guy who poisons the planet and grows GMO crops with neonicotinoids. So, you know, it's impacting my little farm and my ability to grow food, right? And we have people, corporations that have infiltrated government in every country. And that has to stop. And we don't get much support from consumers. We don't get much support from other farmers who've bought into that system. So it's a real challenge. But if we can bring people together and share ideas on how to basically fight the corporate system and our own governments.
Yes. Okay, Ruth, thank you so much for sharing your challenges with us here in this seminar today. Bien, ahora me voy entonces
Now then, Miriensi, you're the next speaker. You have the floor. Could you introduce yourself? 1 minute, please.
Buenos días.
Good morning, good afternoon to everyone. I'm sorry, I didn't hear when you called my name. I don't know if I'll need a minute to express what I want to say. I just wanted to state that if we stopped all the wars, we would save millions upon millions of dollars and euros that are invested into war. And I think with that money, we could guarantee the food security of hundreds of millions of people throughout the planet. Perhaps that sounds idealistic, but we have to imagine a world in which not a single bullet is fired. The priority of all governments needs to be food sovereignty. And in order to achieve that, we have to come up with strategies for food autonomy and the vital role of agroecology. If we turn our gaze to guaranteeing the right to food for millions of people, I think we will have achieved our mission. And for that reason, I think it's essential to strengthen the United Nations, and especially that the member states fulfill their role when it comes to taking decisions about war. Food should not be a weapon of war. No more embargoes and more autonomous production according to our traditional cultures. Thank you very much, Miriensi. Yes, now, Claudio, you have the floor.
Micrófono apagado.
With a microphone, please.
This question is particularly, but not only for Michael and for Harris. As
public interest, civil society, and social movements in the last few years, we have adopted a tactic, it's not a strategy, when we deal with texts that are absolutely dominated by multi-stakeholderism, to identify red lines in which we say we would be willing to negotiate on some points, but these points, 5, 6, or whatever in the text, are not negotiable. I can foresee that in the next year, going up to the summit of the future, we will have text in which we will be looking and ruminating, and we will probably identify red lines. Michael already mentioned one. I mean, many of the documents don't even mention human rights. What greater red line would you like to have? So my question is, does a position of not softening our red lines and saying, yeah, red line is a red line, and if they are crossed, we are out, like we did one time heroically in the FAO, and I'm very proud of it. And secondly, if we do so, will that change anything? If we make enough noise through whatever press we can get, saying this is a completely suprastructural change, civil society and the millions of people who are affected by these things are out because it's outrageous. Is that a political way to go around and to go forward?
Bien, Claudio, muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Claudio. I think at this point I will close the list. We have Bintu, Farouk, and Bide to allow the panelists to respond. So, Bintu, please.
Merci beaucoup. Bonjour.
Thank you very much. Thanks to everyone. My name is Bintu Fune from Bamako in Mali. I've listened with great interest to all this conversation, but I feel like I'm not entirely understanding. I feel like I'm in a bit of a fog as an African farmer. I understand what we are discussing here. However, I think it's going to need a real awareness raising among us peasants who are the true stakeholders. And for us to really create a mobilization, we really need to address this issue. It's in the interest of humanity. That's what's at stake today. But as an African woman, we have very little influence over these issues as Malian women. I have seen that women have very little influence and impact in terms of being, even when they're elected to high office. It's often said that women are behind or at the base of the foundations of the food system, but what do we actually do? I think we really need to mobilize now. Even though our governments are not very influential compared to the multinationals, but people need to mobilize. And there's a huge number of stakeholders who are mobilized today to stand up to land grabbing, expropriation of food. And as I've just got 1 minute, I will say that the debate is open now. We're going to try to bring the debate to the heart of our organizations and our communities so that our voice can be heard. So that's what I wanted to add to this debate. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, señora.
Thank you very much, Ms. Samake. Now let me give the floor to Vide Adedayo.
Thank you very much. My name is Vida Didayo. I'm a lecturer, a researcher, and a practitioner, agricultural practitioner. And it is quite interesting listening to you this afternoon. I work at the University of Lagos, Nigeria. And my concern has to do with the fact that we talk about international corporations, international, agreements, collaborations, and all these things. Most nations try to adopt some of the agreement because, of course, they are part of the signatories to this agreement. But we find out that most, especially Africans, that are signatory to most of this concept. I will use the word concept. We talk about sustainable development today. We are talking about multistakeholderism and multilateralism. All these concepts are good. And of course, we are all aware that most nations, especially the developed nations, they achieve, to some extent, they support their practitioners, especially the farmers, researchers, to achieve this beautiful concept with so many strategic content for achievement. But in Africa, of course, our leaders are part of this, this agreement and signatories. But I find out that most of these nations do not have the capacity to actualize most of this agreement. So I want to know what the global organizations are doing to evaluate the extent to which some of these, do I use the poor nations, achieve some of these key words, big words that is always coming on board. We have sustainable development for a transformation in food system. All these things are big concepts. But if you go to the grassroots in this nation, most of these things are not known to the real farmers who are illiterate. So how can the United Nations and other big organizations support the poor nations to actualize most of these big concepts that are being introduced from year to year, from time to time? Thank you.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ms. Adedayo, for that question. Now we have Farouk. And I see that a few others have asked for the floor, but I'm going to close the list now. I really want to give the chance to the panelists to react to some of the questions that have been put to them. So, Farouk,
I'm Farouk Tariq from, I'm Farouk Tariq from Pakistan. And I'd just like to say that yesterday in Islamabad, there was a seminar attended by feudal lords, so-called agriculture experts, government officials, prime minister, and they said that they are going to hand over 4.4 million acre of land, which is what they claim is barren land, to corporations, to Arab corporations, Chinese corporations, and Pakistani feudal lords for corporate farming to address the issue of food insecurity. Now, we have seen in the 60s the so-called first green revolution, when tractors were introduced and all the fertilizers were introduced, and that has made Pakistan agriculture a useless agriculture. It has reduced the per acre production, and it has not helped the farmers. So instead of giving the land to small farmers, to landless peasantry, the government think that it's only the corporations that can use heavy machinery to cultivate and bring new ideas to agriculture. And we know all their new ideas, which are sheer exploitation, which are taking over of the land, and which is making more inequalities and more injustices. And this is also an undemocratic thing. Now, in Pakistan, there is feudal lords who are at this time ruling the parliament. And these feudal lords are paying not a single penny as agriculture tax. Instead of distributing their land and imposing a wealth or super tax on them, government is handing over more to them. Now, Pakistan Kisan Rabta Committee, a network of 30 peasant organizations, member of Lavia Campesina, has announced a campaign against them. So we are going to fight this land grab, and that has been one of our major challenges in Pakistan. Thank you.
Bien, muchísimas gracias, Farouk.
Thank you very much, Farouk, for sharing what's happening in Pakistan. Okay, the last speaker now is Blanco Kiongo. And with that, we'll close the round of comments and we'll give the floor back to the panelists. Blanco, you have the floor.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. My name is Blanco Kiongo. I come from the ERDC. I'm currently in South Africa, about 200 kilometers from Johannesburg. I wanted to speak with regards to what Saima said. She raised some very important issues. It shows that we have the same struggles. So we have to have solidarity and join forces in order to struggle and fight against the capitalist system. The capitalists do work together to mistreat us and to try to overturn our struggles. So we need to unite. When I talk about us, I mean peasants and farmers. I would like to launch a call for farmer unity. We need to meet and join forces, because especially young people, our struggles are not being given attention in our countries. It's obvious that our young people are being pushed out of farming because the capitalism is grabbing our agriculture. And we need to involve more young people in our struggle. So I want to call for peasant solidarity and young people in farming. Thank you very much for this message focusing on youth and strengthening solidarity between us. I think that's a very important message with regards to how we face up to these challenges and how we overcome the challenges that face us. So now I'd like to ask who from our panelists would like to respond. There are a few questions that have come up in the chat as well, which are very interesting. Of how the far right is accusing the UN of being communist. They're accusing the UN of all sorts of things, including being socialists. And that makes it even harder for us to criticize the UN, because the fascist far right is also attacking the UN. So I'd like to hear from Brid, Molly, and Michael. Go ahead, Brid, you have the floor.
Yes, I'm actually, I mean, it's really wonderful to be in this space and to have the opportunity to especially hear from, so many reflections and comments in relation to how the various dimensions of the food movement are responding to this corporate capture or corporate takeover, as we might call it. And I do have a question. To the food movements, I believe in the way in which you have been able to build the autonomous response to the proposed food summit of last year has really quite a precedent setting, I think. you know, I think sometimes in our exchanges and discourse, we don't pay enough attention to what has happened to movements in, we'll say, in the last 2 or 3 decades, where there's been, I would consider a severe atomization of our efforts. I mean, the previous speaker just said, you know, our struggles are not taken up sufficiently or seriously or taken notice of in our countries, even at the national level. But I think one of the important casualties of this neoliberal corporate-led globalization that we've lived through is the atomization of our movements. So one question I have, you know, to the autonomous food movement is, how have you been able to develop such a very important and precedent-setting response to that proposed summit of last year? I think all of us have important lessons to learn from that. And my other question is of a more general nature. We weren't really, I don't think we sufficiently addressed this dimension, and that's the question of the narrative. I mean, the corporate narrative on, even on multi-stakeholderism itself, has been very, very dominant. I mean, maybe we could almost say it has won the day, except for the struggles from the ground and the pushback we are seeing there. I think one of our very important elements of building our solidarity going forward and trying to achieve a more integrated framework with which we address the summit of the future is our communications strategy. So, and comments on that from any of the panelists or participants, I would really much appreciate. Thank you.
Gracias, Britt. Molly?
Thank you very much, Britt. Molly, please.
Thank you, Sophia. And I'll try to be quick because I really want to hear what Michael and Kelly and Harris have to say. First, building on Blanco's comments, we need to recognize that what's happening today is just a clear continuation of colonialism and racism. It's just broadening, stretching out. So just in the ways that countries were fighting colonialism, they need to be fighting this corporate takeover. Second, in reference to Ruth's comment about we shouldn't worry about including corporations in governance, the argument, and this relates to what Breed was saying about the narrative, the argument is, oh, but we really need the private sector. We need corporations because they have the money, and countries don't have the money to carry out their plans otherwise without these private public partnerships. But the obvious solution to that is fair taxation. We've got to be taxing these corporations and not letting them set up loopholes and ways to escape from taxation. I also have high hopes on this binding agreement on corporations and human rights, that will help to make corporations more accountable. The third point is related to what Bintu had to say about we need awareness raising. Actually, Claudio's comment also questioning whether setting red lines is going to be effective or whether it just isolates civil society. I would say red lines, yes, and do not weaken civil society. You folks are the people who are holding up the banner for the survival of humanity. You are absolutely right about that. And what's needed is greater solidarity among peasants, farmers, but also consumers, as Abigail pointed out. We need people generally to be saying, this corporate capitalist system is not serving our needs. This is not feeding us. And we need something different. So let me turn things over to Michael and Kelly.
Yes, thank you very much, Molly. Perhaps before going to Michael and Kelly, I would like to ask the interpreters for 5 minutes, extending 5 minutes maximum, so that we can give the opportunity to Michael and Kelly to say some final comments. And I also need to make a very brief announcements for the upcoming events during this and next week. Is that okay for the interpreters? Okay, thank you very much, Jorge. Okay, Michael, please.
Thank you, interpreters. I want to focus on solidarity and mobilization and tactics. The tactic on the Food System Summit was an inside-outside tactic. The People's Organization, where the autonomous group, but also the People's Coalition on Food Sovereignty mobilized, and it was profoundly effective to those of us fighting from the inside. Red lines, and I would add militant positions on principle, are key as long as they're coordinated with those of us on the inside working as comrades. What is problematic is when civil society organizations and social movements start judging each other for the different positions they have to take. I would recommend communicate more clearly. What is really troublesome are when organizations go in from the inside, but they go in to negotiate with corporations. And I find that problematic, and that's a different tactic. So this, the nuance of that. Second, working more closely with like-minded member states, I think is key. That's not easy, is working with like-minded coalitions of member states and people's organizations. Some governments are afraid of the language of human rights because it is used as an imperial tool. I'm in Lebanon, I see it firsthand. So we have to, I continue explaining to developing countries that human rights can work in their favor. And the final point I just want to highlight, I don't think we talked about it enough, but to go back to Antonio from the workers organization in Florida. So it's not just solidarity amongst farmers organization, but one of the most powerful forces, and India was an example, is peasant worker alliances. That's really hard to do, but I think a lot more work, and that's really powerful work that can be done. And I'm happy to always put myself at service to be in that space between inside and outside of working with everyone here today. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias, Michael.
Thank you very much, Michael. Now I'll give the floor to Kelly's advisors, I think, because Kelly is no longer there. So you have 1 minute.
No escuchamos.
We can't hear you, unfortunately. Our comments are to thank you for your comments on behalf of our Secretary for Social Dialogue. Thank you very much for the opportunity for being involved in this meeting, which is so important. We have to discuss all the issues relating to food with our population. It can't be up to multinational companies to take responsibility for food sovereignty. We have to look at different models of food sovereignty and governance, which includes human rights. That's all.
Muchísimas gracias. Bien.
Thank you very much. So we have reached the end of today's conversation. It's been a very rich exchange of views and shows that we are trying to be creative to increase solidarity and to tackle this enormous challenge, which is to have this joint struggle against oppression. We need this in order to move forward on a global level. I had promised that I would announce the events for this week. Tomorrow, we have civil society organizations from Africa who have organized their own monitoring. And that event is mostly for African organizations and observers from other regions. But it's going to be a discussion between the African organizations. On Wednesday, we have the next event where we will focus on how corporate intervention has increased and what their role in the summit was. A few colleagues have announced these events in the chat. And on the 17th, next week, we'll have our press conference where we will present our position regarding the Summit +2. So I'd like to thank our panelists for their wonderful interventions. I'd like to thank all the participants for sharing their experience and wisdom. I'd like to thank the interpreters for being here, as always. and those who organized the event, to the Secretariat of CSIPM, and the 3 networks. And including the working group on multi-stakeholderism. So I look forward to seeing you in future events, and I hope you have an excellent rest of the day, however long that is for you.